or good afternoon. We're going to start with our reading review, so get ready with your big books. The two stories that we're going to read is number one, Rocks in His Head, and the other one is American Champion Swimmer. So starting with Rocks in His Head, before we start to the story, we have to do the vocabulary words. So if you have your notebooks there, go where you copy the vocabulary words for Rocks in His Head. Rocks in His Head is the name of the story that we're going to read and talk about. So we have 7 vocabulary words. The first one is stamps, a postage stamp used in letters. Those are back then, or well, nowadays you can still send letters, but it was more common back in the day. So for those letters to send them, you have to put things called stamps. So you indicate where they are going. Now, another one is shorts, our everyday work around a house or a town. For example, doing chores means to clean up your house, to do your bed, all those things that you do for helping at home, those are called chores. Label is a slip of paper marked to indicate what it is or its price. Usually in the supermarkets, you can see that everything has a little like sticker where it says its price. That is labeled. That means that it has the price. They usually do it also with the name of the things, or when you want to say that something belongs to someone, you label them, you put the name of it. Next one is board. There is a board of directors. That means that it's a big group of people that usually take decisions or talk about changes in a company. Number 5 is spare and extra ones, to have one more of that things. For example, I have my keys, but I have the spare keys. I have another copy of my keys. Attic is the room above the house. Usually here in Honduras, houses don't have attics, but in the United States, all of them have attics. Those are like a really big room on the top of the house, where usually people store things in there. And number 7, customer, is a person who purchases something. When you go to a store to buy something, you become a customer. Now we're going to read the story. It starts in page 102. So go grab your big books and pause the video if you need to before continuing to read the story.
Rocks in His Head by Carol Otis Hurst. Illustrated by James Stevenson. Who has rocks in his head, and what does that mean? Genre. A biography is the story of a real person's life, written by another person. How is this author connected to the person she wrote about? Some people collect stamps. Some people collect coins, or dolls, or bottle caps. When he was a boy, my father collected rocks. When he wasn't doing chores at home or learning at school, he'd walk along stone walls and around old quarries looking for rocks. People said he had rocks in his pockets and rocks in his head. He didn't mind. It was usually true. When people asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he'd say, "Something to do with rocks, I think." "There's no money in rocks," someone said. "Probably not," said my father. When he grew up, my father decided to open a gas station. People called them filling stations then. My grandfather helped him build one on Armory Street in Springfield, Massachusetts. They called the station the Antler Filling Station. My father carefully painted the name right over the doorway. Inside the filling station was a desk with a cash drawer, which my father usually forgot to lock, and a table for his chess set. My father built narrow wooden shelves on the back wall and painted them white. People said, "What are those shelves for?" He said, "I've got rocks in my head, I guess." Then, one by one, he placed his rocks and minerals on those shelves. He carefully labeled each rock to show what kind it was and where it had come from. In those days, lots of rich people had automobiles. But then, Henry Ford came out with the Model T. That was a car many people could afford. My father had taken one apart and put it back together again and again until he knew every inch of the Model T. He thought that anyone who had spare parts for the Model T and could repair it so that it drove like new would do a good business. He bought some parts from dealers and found some parts in junkyards. The pile of Model T parts sat just to the left of the lift. Soon, that pile of parts was bigger than the filling station. People said, "If you think people are going to buy that junk, you've got rocks in your head." "Maybe I have," he said. "Maybe I have." But people did come to buy that junk. They came to buy gas, and they came to play chess, and they came to look at the rocks. For a while, my father was too busy for the chess games. He was pumping gas, changing tires, and fixing Model Ts. "Where did you get this one?" a customer would say, holding up a rock. "Found it in a slag pile in New Hampshire," he'd say. Or, "Traded for it with a fella from Nevada. Gave him some garnets from Connecticut." "People in Nevada and Connecticut collect rocks like you do?" people would ask. "Lots of folks have rocks in their heads," said my father. He'd dig into his pocket and take out a rock. "Take a look at this one." Then the stock market fell. At first, people didn't think it would matter much to my father. After all, he had no money in the stock market. "I may have rocks in my head," he said, "but I think bad times are coming." And bad times did come. People couldn't afford to buy new cars or fix their old ones. When business was slow, my father would play chess with some of his customers. When business was very slow, my grandfather would mind the filling station, and we'd pile as many of us kids as would fit into our Model T, and we'd hunt for more rocks with my father. He had to build more shelves for the rocks, up the west wall of the station. Then people stopped coming for gas. They stopped coming to play chess. And they even stopped coming to look at the rocks and minerals. They were all too busy looking for work. One day, my father picked up the chess set and carefully packed it in a big box. He took down each mineral, wrapped it in newspaper, and carefully placed it in a wooden box. When his friends came with a truck to help us move, they said, "Watch out for those wooden boxes. He's got rocks in his boxes now." "Yes, sir," said my father. "That's just what I got in there. Take a look at this one." The house we moved to was old and falling apart. My father said he'd have it fixed up in no time. But before he started in on the repairs, we had to take those rocks up to the attic, where he'd already built tiny little wooden shelves. My father did fix up the old house, and after he finished each repair, he went up to the attic with his rocks. He spent a lot of time reading about rocks, too. "If you think those rocks are ever going to do you any good," said my mother, "you've got rocks in your head." "Maybe I have," said my father. "Maybe I have." He reached into his pocket. "Take a look at this one." My father spent a lot of time looking for any job he could find. Most jobs lasted only a day or two. On rainy days, when my father could find no other work, he'd take the bus to the Science Museum. They had a whole room full of glass cases containing many rocks. Sometimes he'd spend the whole day in that room. One afternoon, he looked up to see a lady standing beside him. "I've seen you here before," she said. "I come here a lot," he said. "I guess I've got rocks in my head." "Tell me what you're looking for," she said. "I'm looking for rocks that are better than mine," he said. "How many did you find?" she asked. 10, he said. The lady looked around at the hundreds of rocks in all those glass cases. "Only 10? "Maybe 11, he said. He smiled. She did too. "You have got rocks in your head," she said. "I'm Grace Johnson, the director of this museum. These rocks have come from all over the world." "So have mine," said my father. He reached into his pocket. "Take a look at this one," he said. "Did you study rocks at college?" she asked. "Couldn't afford to go to college," he said. "Let me see the rest of your rocks," she said. Mrs. Johnson got out her big Packard touring car, and my father got in. They drove to our house. "Where are the rocks?" she asked. "Up here," said my father, leading the way to the attic. "Watch your step." 2 hours later, Mrs. Johnson said, "I can't hire you as a mineralogist. The board won't allow it. But I need a night janitor at the museum. Will you take the job?" "Will I be cleaning rocks?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. So my father took the job as night janitor at the museum. Before he went home, he'd open some of the mineral cases and scrub some of the rocks with a toothbrush until they sparkled like diamonds. Mrs. Johnson came in early for work one morning and saw him carefully writing a new label for one of the rocks. "What are you doing?" she asked. "One rock was labeled wrong," he said. "I fixed it." Mrs. Johnson smiled. "I've been talking to the board of directors. They know that I need a person here who knows as much about rocks as you do." "What about the college education?" he asked. She said, "I told them I need somebody with rocks in his head and rocks in his pockets. Are you it?" "Maybe I am," said my father. "Maybe I am." He reached into his pocket and took out a rock. "Take a look at this one," he said.
That one was a great story, right, guys? I like that one really much. Now we're going to start with our second story, that is American Champion Swimmer. Remember to pay really closely attention to the details of each of these stories. As always, we have to talk about the vocabulary words. Vocabulary words are really important because it helps us understand better the story. So grab your notebooks again and look where you copy the vocabulary words of this story. Get ready. America's champion swimmer Gertrude Ederle. We have 7 vocabulary words today, so let's read them. Number 1, drowned. To die under water or other liquid of suffocation. This happens a lot on oceans or on pools. When you don't know how to swim, you can drown. Number 2, medals are prizes or ribbons you win. For example, on the spelling bee, they give some medals for the winners. Number 3, continue, to keep it going. For example, you need to continue doing a great job as you have been doing all these days. To celebrate is to have a party. When people win something, they celebrate. Stroke is a smooth swing. When people swim, they do some strokes. Current, the movement of the ocean water. Sometimes the current of the oceans are really heavy. That means that the ocean movement is really fast. Now that we know the vocabulary words, we're going to start reading the story. And the story starts in page 142. So grab your big books and get ready.
America's Champion Swimmer, Gertrude Ederle, by David A. Adler, illustrated by Terry Widener. How did Gertrude Ederle surprise the world? Genre: a biography gives facts about a real person's life. Why did the author write a biography about Gertrude Ederle? In 1906, women were kept out of many clubs and restaurants. In most states, they were not allowed to vote. Many people felt a woman's place was in the home. But Gertrude Ederle's place was in the water. Gertrude Ederle was born on October 23, 1906. She was the third of 6 children and was raised in New York City, where she lived in an apartment next to her father's butcher shop. Her family called her Gertie. Most everyone else called her Trudy. Trudy spent her early years playing on the sidewalks of New York. It wasn't until she was 7 that she had her first adventure in the water. While visiting her grandmother in Germany, Trudy fell into a pond and nearly drowned. After that near disaster, Trudy's father was determined to teach her to swim. For her first lesson, he tied one end of a rope to Trudy's waist
and held on to the other end. He put Trudy into a river and told her to paddle like a dog. Trudy mastered the dog paddle. She joined her older sister Margaret and the other children in the water and copied their strokes. Soon Trudy swam better than any of them. From that summer on, it was hard to keep Trudy out of the water. She loved to swim. At the age of 13, she became a member of the New York Women's Swimming Association and took lessons there. At 15, Trudy won her first big race. The next year, she attempted to be the first woman to swim the more than 17 miles from Lower Manhattan to Sandy Hook, New Jersey. When Trudy slowed down, her sister Margaret yelled, "Get going, lazy bones!" And Trudy did. She finished in just over 7 hours, and she beat the men's record. People were beginning to notice Gertrude Aderly. Newspapers described her as courageous, determined, modest, and poised. They called her the most perfect swimmer. Trudy's mother said she was just a plain home girl. In 1924, this plain home girl was good enough to make the U.S. Olympic team. Trudy won 3 medals at the Games in Paris. Her team won more points than all the other countries' swimming teams combined. By 1925, Trudy had set 29 U.S. and world records. She was determined to take on the ultimate challenge, the English Channel. Many had tried to swim the more than 20-mile-wide body of cold, rough water that separates England from France, but only 5 men, and no women, had ever made it all the way across. Many people were sure Trudy couldn't do it. A newspaper editorial declared that Trudy wouldn't make it, and that women must admit they would remain forever the weaker sex. It didn't matter to Trudy what people said or wrote. She was going to swim the channel. Early in the morning on August 18, 1925, Trudy stepped into the water at Cape Grisnez, France, the starting point for the swim. For almost 9 hours, she fought the strong current. Then, when Trudy had less than 7 miles to go, her trainer thought she had swallowed too much water and pulled her, crying, from the sea. Trudy did not give up her dream. She found a new trainer, and a year later, on Friday, August 6, 1926, she was ready to try again. Trudy wore a red bathing cap and a 2-piece bathing suit and goggles that she and her sister Margaret had designed. To protect her from the icy cold water, Margaret coated Trudy with lanolin and heavy grease. The greasing took a long time, too long for Trudy. "For heaven's sake," she complained, "let's get started." Finally, at a little past 7 in the morning, she stepped into the water. "Gee, but it's cold," Trudy said. Trudy's father, her sister Margaret, her trainer, and a few other swimmers were on board a tugboat named Alsace. The boat would accompany Trudy to make sure she didn't get lost in the fog and was safe from jellyfish, sharks, and the channel's powerful currents. There was a second boat, too, with reporters and photographers on board. As the Alsace bobbed up and down in the choppy water, Margaret wrote in chalk on the side of the boat, "This way, old kid." She drew an arrow that pointed to England. To entertain Trudy, Margaret and some of the others sang American songs, including The Star-Spangled Banner and East Side, West Side. Trudy said the songs kept her brain and spirit good. At first, the sea was calm. Trudy swam so fast that her trainer was afraid she would tire herself out. He ordered her to slow down. Trudy refused. At about 10:30 in the morning, Trudy had her first meal. She floated on her back and ate chicken and drank beef broth. A while later, she ate chocolate and chewed on sugar cubes. Then she swam on. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, it started to rain. A strong wind stirred the water. For a while, Trudy would swim forward a few feet, only to be pulled back twice as far. By 6 o'clock, the tide was stronger. The waves were 20 feet high. The rough water made the people aboard the Alsace and the newsboat seasick. Trudy's trainer was sure she couldn't finish the swim. He told her to give up. "No, no!" Trudy yelled over the sound of the waves. She kept swimming. In the next few hours, the rain and wind became stronger and the sea rougher. At times, the rough water pulled the boats away, out of Trudy's sight. She was scared. It was eerie being out there all alone. Now Trudy began to have trouble kicking in the water. When the Alsace came close again, Trudy said her left leg had become stiff. Her trainer was frightened for her. He yelled, "You must come out!" "What for?" Trudy shouted and kept swimming. Trudy continued to fight the tide and the constant stinging spray of water in her face. She knew she would either swim the channel or drown. As Trudy neared Kingsdown, on the coast of England, she saw thousands of people gathered to greet her. They lit flares to guide her to shore. At about 9:40 at night, after more than 14 hours in the water, Trudy's feet touched land. Hundreds of people, fully dressed, waded into the water to greet her. When she reached the shore, her father hugged Trudy and wrapped her in a warm robe. "I knew if it could be done, it had to be done, and I did it," Trudy said after she got ashore. "All the women of the world will celebrate." Trudy swam the channel in just 14 hours and 31 minutes. She beat the men's record by almost 2 hours. In newspapers across the world, Trudy's swim was called history-making. Reporters declared that the myth that women are the weaker sex was shattered and shattered forever. Trudy sailed home aboard the SS Berengaria. After 6 days at sea, the ship entered New York Harbor. 2 airplanes circled and tipped their wings to greet Trudy. People on boats of all kinds rang their bells and tooted their horns to salute her. Foghorns sounded. Trudy climbed into an open car for a parade up Lower Broadway. An estimated 2 million people, many of them women, stood and cheered. They threw scraps of newspaper, ticker tape, pages torn from telephone books, and rolls of toilet paper. When her car arrived at the New York City Hall, Mayor Jimmy Walker praised Trudy for her courage, grace, and athletic prowess. "American women," he said, "have ever added to the glory of our nation." President Calvin Coolidge sent a message that was read at the ceremony. He called Trudy America's best girl. And she was. Gertrude Aderly had become a beacon of strength to girls and women everywhere.
Those two are great stories. I like them both. My favorite actually is Roxanne He Said. What is your favorite? Great. Now, we're going to do some timeline. Using these little like squares that you see on the screen, we're going to do one for each of the story. We're going to write the name of the story on the top and then tell me what happened first, what happened next, and at the end, what happened in both of the stories. One for Rocks in His Head and another one for um, America's Champion Swimmer. I know that you already done it, but this time I want to see drawings in each one of them, okay? And when you finish, that will be it for reading. I hope you have a nice day. I love you a lot. I miss you so much every single day. Have an amazing day.